Hey guys, welcome back to Clownfish TV. This is Neon. I am not here with Geeky Sparkles. She's actually sitting this video out. We're going to talk about the comic book industry. We're going to talk about Archie Comics, and something very interesting happened this week. Got to give a hat tip to Perch, who was talking about it on Twitter. Archie Comics is going back to Kickstarter. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, because as we have mentioned in several videos talking about crowdfunding comics and how the perception of crowdfunding has changed over the last few years, Archie Comics was bullied, and that's what it was, that they were harassed and bullied off of Kickstarter about 6 years ago. So now they're going back to Kickstarter with a Kevin Keller celebration. Very interesting. So apparently the stigma of Kickstarter no longer exists. And you know, I think with the change in the marketplace, Kickstarter is basically the new diamond. I think publishers are going to use Kickstarter and Indiegogo. Indiegogo exists too, believe it or not, to crowdfund, take pre-orders for comic books going forward. And then the shops basically, you know, whichever shops are left over, they get the leftovers. So we're going to talk about that. Before we get into it any further, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, guys. Again, over 235,000 subs. Thank you for the support. It's been incredible. The last couple years, you guys have been great. We do talk about comics, having worked in comics for a number of years. Currently self-publishing some comic books and looking to self-publish more. And yeah, you know, we've been kind of following the situation with crowdfunding and the shift in crowdfunding, because back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean like 2 or 3 years ago, if you went to crowdfunding, it's because you were an amateur. You couldn't get a publisher to pick up your book. You were desperate, you were an e-beggar, and literally there were comic book news outlets that were calling people using crowdfunding early on e-beggars. And then we had some pretty sizable campaigns. We had, of course, you know, Keanu Reeves' Kickstarter for Berserker. We had Boom Do Another one for Power Rangers. We had Todd McFarlane making like $3 million off of Spawn. And over on the Indiegogo side, you know, you have a lot of guys like Ethan Van Sciver making over $1 million on Cyberfrog. And countless other campaigns making six figures. So it's become very lucrative. And with the direct market shrinking and with the pandemic throwing a wrench into things and actually shuttering some comic shops forever, and with Diamond, I don't even know where the hell Diamond is at right now. It has become, you know, a more viable option. Actually, it might be the only option for a lot of projects. But it was very interesting to see Archie Comics go back to the Kickstarter well. Again, because they were literally harassed and bullied off of the platform 5 or 6 years ago by their peers, by their concerned peers, who thought that a publisher like Archie had no business using crowdfunding. And you know what? They tried the same bullshit with Boom. They tried to harass and guilt Boom Studios off of Kickstarter, saying that, you know, they had no business being there, that they were literally taking money away from independent creators. And that was not the case. There were people that were there just for Keanu Reeves' comic, and that was it. You know, just like other major crowdfunders. It's so weird that comics is like this, because you look at movies or video games, and you have, you know, directors and showrunners and all these people that, you know, probably could go through a studio system using crowdfunding. They don't get harassed. You know, they crowdfunded a Veronica Mars movie. They crowdfunded another season of Reading Rainbow, of Mystery Science Theater, and they weren't shamed or harassed off the platform. But comic book people are. And it's so weird because the comic book campaigns are very, very small on average compared to the Hollywood campaigns and the video game campaigns. But that is the way the industry is right now, right? So Boom did not listen, and they made a ton of money for Berserker, and they wound up selling at retail like 600,000 copies of this comic. And Archie, they're going back to the well now. They're not getting bullied off this time. So we're going to read about that and then talk about what happened before. This is coming from Screen Rant. Archie Comics Kickstarter launches for Kevin Keller celebration. Dan Parent has announced a new Kickstarter to create the Kevin Keller celebration in honor of the character's 10th anniversary. A Kickstarter campaign for the Kevin Keller celebration, an omnibus celebrating the Archie Comics character's 10th anniversary, has been announced by writer and artist Dan Parent. Keller was introduced as Riverdale's first LGBTQIA plus resident. He's gay. And this new collection is a chronicle of his first decade. The Riverdale gang, including Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead, and the rest, are some of pop culture's most iconic characters. And now they're some of pop culture's most promiscuous characters. Thanks, CW. Yeah, thanks for that. With an audience that stretches beyond the typical comic book demographic, beginning of the decade, Archie Comics shook up its traditional style, releasing books such as The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, inaugurating a line of titles featuring horror-based interpretations of some of their characters, talking about how Kevin Keller appeared in 2010. I thought it was longer than that, but yeah, I guess it's only been 2010. In Veronica. Now, in celebration of the 10th anniversary, Dan Parent has announced the kickoff of a Kickstarter campaign to help create Kevin Keller Celebration, a 700-page omnibus. It also celebrates the 80th anniversary of Archie Comics. How dare they? How dare they? So they don't mention anything in the Screen Rant article about how Archie Comics tried doing this in 2015 and they were bullied and harassed off the platform by the concerned comic book industry. It didn't completely go down the memory hole, and I have to wonder if they didn't look at Boom Studios' success and be like, you know what, we can do that too. There's no shame in doing this. So this was, coming from the Hollywood Reporter 2015, Archie Comics cancels their $350,000 Kickstarter campaign after criticism. It was no longer about the books and how amazing they will be, the company explained in a statement. Only 5 days after its launch, Archie Comics has canceled a crowdfunding campaign intended to produce 3 new comic book series, citing critical response to the campaign itself as the reason why. They wanted to raise $350,000 to accelerate the launch of 3 new comic books, spinning out of the then relaunch of the Archie series. They had Adam Hughes, Chip Zdarsky, and Dan Parent on those books. Dan Parent, of course, goes back to Kickstarter with Kevin Keller. Chip Zdarsky is over at Substack. Do we see a pattern here? Speaking of Substack, do we see a pattern here? Anytime there's a new way to make comics, to market comics, here comes the comic book industry with their concerns. Talk about crabs in a fucking bucket. I'm just saying. This is the way it is. And you're shocked that they came after people so hard on Indiegogo. It has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with bitterness. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. So in a statement released Friday, this again was 2015, Archie noted that while the response to the new titles has been amazing, the reaction to an established brand like Archie crowdfunding has not been. Adding that although the intent had originally been to start work on the series ahead of schedule, allowed by Archie's own funds, the response became another conversation, leading us further away from the purpose of the whole campaign. We fully expected our goal to be funded. It was no longer about the books and how amazing they will be. We don't want that. This is why we're shutting the Kickstarter down today. 5 days into it. 5 days into it. We don't regret trying something new. It's what Archie's been about for the last 6 years. We'll continue to be a fearless, risk-taking, and vibrant brand that will do its best to embrace new platforms, technology, and ways to interact with fans. As a company, we have always prided ourselves on pushing boundaries and challenging expectations and perceptions. No, what happened, and I remember, this is a very polite way of putting it, because the comic book industry doesn't want to admit when it's behaving in a very shitty fashion, but they bullied Archie. They bullied Archie Comics. They harassed Archie Comics. They wrote hit pieces about Archie Comics until they shut the campaign down. They listened to Twitter and they lost money. So here we are 6 years later, and for all the risk taking, they let Boom Studios suffer the slings and arrows of their peers, and they let Boom Studios lead the way, and they did phenomenally well. And Archie should have stuck to their guns. They were chased off by a Twitter mob before people really had an idea of how vicious how vicious Twitter mobs actually could be, and that they don't have your business's best interests in mind. That's for damn sure, especially in the comic book industry, which is full of so many bitter, jealous, catty, backbiting, horrible people. That's not everybody. There's some very good people that work in comics, but the ones that hang out on Twitter all day, yeah, they're the ones who get you to pull the plug on your campaign. And Kickstarter is becoming more and more important to comics, which is why I think they're trying to gatekeep it. We talked about that too. There's been a lot of gatekeeping going on with Kickstarter, so people are going over to Indiegogo. But if you go to Indiegogo, Twitter says you're an alt-right Nazi. It's so crazy. I think they're just trying to shut off any means of producing comics outside the system. And again, there are claims that it's political. I don't think it's political at all. I think it's just sour grapes. I think there are a lot of people out there who are just miserable people and they can't stand it that other people who maybe they don't agree with are getting ahead, making money in comics. They're looking at their future and being like, oh shit, the bottom is falling out of the direct market. They're canceling titles. My page rates are terrible. That Hollywood deal never came through. I don't know what I'm going to do, but how dare those YouTubers make any money making comics? How dare they? So instead of going and starting a YouTube channel yourself, and trying to make some money yourself, you're just going to take pot shots at people who are already doing it. And, they worked a little something behind the scenes, and they got certain people banned from Kickstarter. And then they couldn't do the same thing with Indiegogo. I'm sure if they thought they could do it or could do it, they would have done it by now. So instead, they just painted Indiegogo with a very broad brush and said, Indiegogo is where all the Nazis go for their Nazi comics. Those Nazi comics are terrible, even if they're just continuations of pre-existing series done by former DC and Marvel people. They're still terrible. Terrible. It's terrible that they're platforming these Nazis. God, it's ridiculous. Same group of people who were bitching about it in 2015 are still bitching about it in 2021. But yeah, Boom hasn't listened. Here's a list of the most successful comics Kickstarters of all time. And I'm actually going to go out here and we'll go over their list, but I've got a list of the most successful Kickstarter and Indiegogo campaigns of all time because they're missing out. Girl Genius is on here. Check Please is on here. Lady Death is on here. Now, Check Please is interesting because that was a webcomic, but it was also picked up by First Second Books. Why does First Second need Kickstarter money? You're taking money out of the pockets of other independent creators, right? Lady Death, Come On Comics. I don't know what that one is. That's like a game thing. Ava's Demon, another webcomic. The Tomorrow Girl, webcomic. Control Alt Delete, a webcomic. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Boom. The Order of the Stick, webcomic. And Berserker, #1. Again, webcomic. Now, if you want to throw in Todd McFarlane's campaign for Spawn, it was more of a toy campaign, but he also had a comic book element. So I think you could probably throw that in too. Now, if you're looking at, everything, if you're looking at Indiegogo too, you've got The Order of the Stick in here. You've got Berserker, but you've got Ethan Van Sciver's Cyberfrog 2 on Indiegogo. A couple of art books. We've got Earthworm Jim at $815,000 on Indiegogo. Power Rangers. Let's find some other Indiegogos. Icarus and the Sun. Not a Comicsgate guy. I think it's Gabriel Piccolo, who does Teen Titans. Yeah, $596,000. Another Ethan Van Sciver book, $500,000. This is just sour grapes, man. But yeah, honorable mention would go to Spawn, which did about $3.5 million for an action figure and comic book package. Not strictly comics, but still comic related. Anyway, very interesting. Things are changing. I do think Kickstarter and Indiegogo are going to eventually replace Diamond for a lot of publishers as a litmus test of what the actual demand is for a comic book. And if you can't muster up enough pre-orders on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, then there might not be enough interest in your book to actually print it. We'll see what happens. But I think we're going to see more publishers now jump back into it. And don't be bullied by Twitter. Twitter doesn't matter. Twitter doesn't matter. Gonna wrap it up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants, guys. We'll talk later.